Well, greetings and welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Fredland, located in the great state of Minnesota. First, let me express my gratitude to our partners. Our official sponsor is Running Aces. Our official tour is Next Level Poker, which is led by World Series of Poker bracelet winner Chris Fox Wallace. Another partner we have is the Poker is Fun Tour, led by Minnesota Poker Hall of Famer Mike Schneider, which is having their first events coming up this weekend at Canterbury Park, featuring a win and show tournament where the winning hand must be shown. And our final partner is PokerCoaching.com, which is a training site for Jonathan Little. Well, it continues to be a great stretch at the tables for myself and a number of folks associated with the podcast. We're learning from each other, challenging how we approach the game, and building confidence in making the right plays. Obviously, variance has something to say about it, but I can tell you that I am improving significantly on the skill side, just doing through the studying that I'm doing with the book and with the podcast and the discussions that we're having, and of course getting to chat with some of the greatest players around. Currently, we're in our third part of a 5-part discussion of Jonathan Little's book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1, and this week we are covering chapters 7 and 8. After the quick commercial, you'll hear some audio submitted by Jonathan Little, followed by the continued conversation that we had among a number of recreational players talking about some of our key takeaways from the book. Many of you have sent in a number of great topics and ideas around the podcast as we continue to move forward, and once we get past the book discussion, we are going to be digging into some specific topics and asking for a number of top players' input into that subject. And so some of that input we're going to get is from fantastic players like Jonathan Little and Fox Wallace, Mike Schneider, Ku Vang, Aaron Johnson, Vlad Revniaga, Max Havlish, Brian Soja, and other people that have agreed to give us some input into some really relevant topics that I think are really going to strike home for the more advanced players, but also the recreational players. So stay tuned. We got some great things ahead, and if you have any other ideas, feel free to reach out to me through Facebook or Twitter or email. That's all cool. I did have a bunch of business cards made up. If anybody wants any of those to help spread the word about what we're doing, on there it has a lot of information as far as an easy way that you can find the podcast at runningaces.com or runaces.com or through SoundCloud. So if you want to help spread the word, I'm happy to give you some of those, even willing to format those and put your name on it if you want to be one of our ambassadors for Rec Poker and what we're doing here. So thanks for all of you who have already taken some steps and told your friends about the podcast. The numbers keep growing, and it's exciting to see. Obviously, we're just a dude doing a podcast, not getting paid for it. So we're just having fun. But the bigger, the better, and the more input we can get and the more feedback, the better the end result is going to be. So before we get started, just one more thing. I want to do a quick plug for All In for Africa. For those of you who know me, I'm involved in leading a nonprofit, and one of the things that we do is these charity poker tournaments, which we started a few years ago, and our 7th one, All In for Africa, is going to be held October 28th at Running Aces at 10:30 in the morning, and a couple of really cool announcements. Pay attention to these. First of all, Next Level Poker is going to be broadcasting live the final table. Actually, once we get down to the final 8, because of the technology, that's when they can start broadcasting. It will not be showing whole cards, so there won't be any delay. It'll be broadcast live through a number of sites. And so follow us on Twitter at All In for Africa or Facebook, and that way you'll find out what those links are that you can use to follow the final table if you get busted out early or if you're not able to play. But that's a cool thing. And then secondly, we had a huge donation made for All In for Africa, and that is a trip for 2 to Hawaii, first-class flights, a stay at the Four Seasons Resort on Maui, and a grand total of about $9,500 of value. And we're going to somehow be incorporating that into the All In for Africa tournament. Right now, we're thinking maybe doing that as a mystery bounty. So if you knock somebody out who nobody knows, it's going to be a random bounty, you will get that trip. So just by playing the tournament, you'll have a chance to win that. We'll have a number of other mystery bounties. We will also have 45 to 50 people playing as scheduled bounties, so you know who they are and what their prizes are. And then a good chunk of the money goes to the charity, and a good chunk is still paid out in cash. So it's still a high-value tournament. Typically, when you add up all the bounties and the cash that's paid out, it ends up being an overlay. So it's a good value to the players, but it's a lot of fun. It's just a fantastic tournament. Really wish you could make it out for that. I'm almost done with the flyer, which includes pictures of all the bounties, so you can watch for that online and at Running Aces. And even if you can't play the event, but you want to support what we're doing, we have a partnership with Reg Charity, and through that we are supporting the Against Malaria Foundation, doing fantastic work in preventing malaria. And we have a page set up on their website that you can give directly to. So the money goes directly to them, but we know how many people are involved through what we're doing. So you can go to againstmalaria.com/AIFA, AIFA, which is short for All in for Africa. So enough with that. Let's give a quick shout out to our official sponsor, and then we'll launch into the input and discussion around Chapter 7 and 8 of the book. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker.
Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here on the Rec Poker podcast, continuing to go over my first and best-selling book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1. This is a fantastic book if you are looking to learn how to be good at poker tournaments. And at the same time, it's also very good if you want to learn how to play deep stacked poker, which is great for cash games. Make sure you go back and listen to the previous parts of this book club, because I'm not going to say they necessarily are required for what's coming up, but it will certainly be beneficial to you. So make sure you go back and listen to the past podcasts if you have not already. So today we're going to talk about playing the turn and playing the river in deep stacked poker. Playing the turn is an interesting spot because a lot of players start to act somewhat honestly. So I mentioned in the previous part of this that a lot of players will continuation bet with a very wide range on the flop. They read this in a book somewhere that they should raise and continuation bet a lot. And that's a fine strategy if your opponents are very weak and tight, but clearly if you're reading this book and trying to play well, you're not going to be weak and tight. So when they bet the flop, they're going to have a wide range. But when they get to the turn, often a lot of players will have somewhat honest ranges because they have a lot of garbage in their range and they don't feel inclined to continue bluffing with it. I mean, think about your games, right? You really see players just barreling off with total garbage on the flop, turn, and river? It's like, probably not, right? So whenever you do call their flop bet, so say someone raises, you call, flop comes, they bet, you call. Now here we are on the turn. If they check, very often in these small and medium stakes games, you should just put out a bet. It doesn't have to be a big bet. It can be something like a third pot or 40% pot or half pot. And that's going to pick up the pot for you. And that's because your opponents, when they check, often have a range and balance. They have way too many junk hands in their range. And if they have too many junky hands, well, they have to check fold, and that's going to allow you to steal the pot. Alternatively, another very strong play is to check raise. So I just mentioned how a lot of players play somewhat honestly on the turn. However, if they're still betting with stuff like top pair or maybe even middle pair if they're playing way too aggressively, or if they're betting with some of that junk, those are great players to raise or check raise on the turn because they really cannot defend that well. And you're going to find that most players think that the turn raise or check raise screams strength. And really, it does, because think about your games. You're really not getting check raised or raised on the turn very often at all unless your opponent shows up with the nuts. So, when that's the case, you should often be getting out of the way. That said, if you find your opponents are raising you on the turn a ton, you should make sure you adjust by arriving at the turn with strong ranges so that you can realistically defend your turn betting range, or just by not betting the turn so often. It's okay to check call. I think something that a lot of amateur players get in trouble with is they think that if they were the aggressor, they must continue being the aggressor. And if they're not the aggressor because they decide to check, well, then they're check folding. And you do not want to make it obvious to your opponent that you're check folding or checking with the intention of folding, because that just allows them to very easily bet. So you want to make sure that when you check, it does not only mean that you are giving up. You never want to have that to be the case. It's okay to give up sometimes, but certainly not all the time or anywhere near all the time. So what you can do is say you raise with a hand like, let's say Queen Jack, and the flop comes Queen 7-3. You bet, your opponent calls, and the turn's an 8. So Queen 7-3-8. This is a pretty good spot to check versus aggressive players, because if you think about their flop calling range, what is it really going to be on queen 7-3? Well, it's going to be some queens, which you actually lose to a decent amount of those. It's going to be some sevens, which are not going to pay you off on the turn in the river, unless they have 8-7 and made 2 pair. And it's going to be the random gut shot straight draws, like 6-5, 6-4, and 5-4. And those hands are going to fold if you bet on the turn. At least some of them will. Maybe 6-5 won't. So this is a great spot to check versus an aggressive player with the intention of check calling the turn and then check calling the river. You give your opponent the opportunity to bluff, and also you make it impossible for him to blow you off your hand because now you're just calling the turn in the river, right? Whereas if you bet the turn, say you bet, 8 big blinds on the turn, which is maybe half pot at this point, and your opponent raises to 24 big blinds, well, now all of a sudden you're playing a huge pot with queen jack for top pair marginal kicker, and that's certainly not where you want to be. So we mentioned this in the previous part about how you want to think ahead about how the hand's likely to play out, and this is a really good example of that. And we also discuss how you should generally play draws and top pairs on the turn, because very often those are the main hands you're going to have. Drawing hands are interesting. Usually you just want to continue betting with your draws, assuming you don't think you're going to get raised. If your draw is good enough to check call, or call if your opponent bets, that's often fine to do. For example, if you have the ace-high flush draw, often that's going to be a strong enough hand to call if your opponent bets, so you don't really need to be raising or betting with that draw necessarily. Whereas if you have the nut-low flush draw, some 5-4 suited or something, then often you do want to be betting and playing aggressively because 5-4 or 5-high cannot win at showdown on the river, whereas ace-high sometimes does. So as your draws get weaker to a point, you typically want to play them aggressively because they're not strong enough to call on their own merits. Then we discuss playing the river when deep stacked, and river play is pretty interesting because on the river you either have a very strong made hand, you have a marginal made hand, or you have nothing. And that's a little bit different than the flop and the turn, because on the flop and the turn you either have a premium made hand, a marginal made hand, a draw, which has some amount of equity, or nothing. So you're missing draws on the river, and that leads to some interesting scenarios because quite often one player has what's referred to as a polarized range, which means either a very good hand or a very bad hand. Usually that's going to be premium made hands and busted draws. And the other player has a lot of marginal made hands. So one player is either betting for value with the nuts or effective nuts, or they're bluffing, and the other player is often either calling or folding with a marginal made hand. So anyway, we discussed this a little bit in the book. We mentioned earlier about how you want to think about your expected value, and there are often spots where you can call when you think you're beat, but you should call based on your pot odds. So, for example, say you get to the river and your opponent bets 20% pot. The way you figure out how often you need to win is you take the bet size, which is 0.2, and divide that by what the total pot will be after you call. So it'll be the pot size, one pot size, because that's the pot, plus your opponent's 0.2, plus your 0.2. So you do 0.2 divided by 1.4, which means you need to win 1/7 of the time when your opponent makes that 0.2 bet. So, do we think we're going to win 1/7 of the time versus our particular opponent if you have a hand like bottom pair? Well, that's up for you to determine. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. It depends on the way the board runs out. But understand that you can think you're beat, right? You can think you have the best hand 30% of the time, which is not very often at all, but still have a really easy call on the river. So do not think that you have to call on the river every single time, or don't think you only have to call whenever you think you have the best hand. You want to look at the pot odds and go from there. And often, you're going to find that if you situate your ranges correctly on the previous streets, you'll have a pretty good amount of marginal made hands that are very, very easy to call with, especially when your opponents are not betting huge on the river. Because quite often you need to win like 20% of the time on the river, and very often hands like middle pair or top pair bad kicker will win 20% of the time. However, if you do something like you bet the flop and you bet the turn with all of your strong hands every single time, well, when you get to the river in a passive manner, usually you're going to have stuff like bottom pair and worse, and that's not going to work out too well for you because you're going to have to fold too often. Or you're forced making a somewhat big call with something like bottom pair, which is not really what you want to do. When you're value betting versus weak opponents on the river, you often want to bet an amount that they can conceivably call. However, you don't want to take that too far and bet tiny because you do want to make sure you get value. If you arrive on the river, and let's say you have the nut flush, and you think that your opponent either has a busted straight draw, a flush, or a set. You think for whatever reason they cannot have very many top pairs and middle pairs based on the way the hand played out. Or you think that if they do have top pair or middle pair, they will just fold if you make any bet because they fear the obvious flush that came in. In that scenario, you should very often bet very large, perhaps huge, 3 times the size of the pot, 2 times the size of the pot, because no one's ever folding a flush and no one's folding a set. I mean, maybe they'll fold a set, but no one's ever folding a flush. So that's a scenario where you can often bet very big. Alternatively, say you do have the flush in the same scenario and you think your opponent can just never have the flush based on the way the hand played out. Let's say, for example, they raised pre-flop, you called, and you flop a flush draw. They bet the flop, you call. They bet the turn, you call. You get there on the river when the flush comes and they check. That's a spot where they can almost never have a flush. So in that scenario, you should often not bet very big versus amateur players because they're going to fold every single time if you bet big. Whereas if you bet smaller, probably half pot or less, they're going to call you every time with their top and middle pairs because they have top pair and you're betting somewhat small. So that's how you want to be thinking against most amateur players. As you start playing against better players, you're going to want to have a balanced river betting strategy, but that's not discussed too incredibly much in the book. We discussed that a decent amount over at pokercoaching.com. There we have a lot of interactive hand quizzes and webinars discussing how to balance your range and thinking about how to play versus strong opponents. Another concept that comes up in small stakes tournaments a lot is not putting your opponent all in. So a lot of amateur players really, really, really don't want to go broke. And if they don't want to go broke and you're trying to extract value from your opponent because you have what you think is the best made hand, you can very often bet an amount that is large, but still not an amount that's all in. You can leave them with something like 8 or 10 big blinds, which is not a lot, but a lot of amateur players will look at that and think, well, okay, if I lose, I'm still in the tournament. And they'll call in that scenario. Whereas if you put them all in, maybe they'll fold. So you can often put them all in when you're bluffing, and you can bet small when you're value betting. And clearly, if you can use that strategy to your advantage, you will just crush your opponents because you can lead them to making whatever play you want them to make. When you bet the river and you get raised in small stakes games, I would strongly suggest you just fold unless you have a really good hand. I do not think that very many small stakes players are bluffing, at least at this point, on the river whenever you bet and they raise you. And you have to understand, a lot of people on the river play very straightforwardly. They do not value bet nearly enough, and they do not bluff nearly enough. They just play a really passive river strategy. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how it's relatively easy to learn pre-flop strategy because there are only so many spots to come up. But on the river, it's somewhat difficult because there are a ton of situations, and also on the river, the amounts that you are betting and playing for are very large. And a lot of people get passive when they're playing for all the money. So anyway, a lot of people on the river, whenever you bet and they raise you, they're going to show you the nuts every time. So do not get tricked into thinking that, if you bet something like top pair 3 times, top pair, top kicker, like ace king, say it comes king 7-3, king 7-3, 9-4. You bet the flop, you bet the turn, you bet the river, and then your opponent raises you on the river. You got a pretty easy fold versus the majority of small stakes players. If your opponent's very aggressive, of course, that goes out the window, but it's up for you to determine what your opponents are doing right or wrong. So that's going to be it for today. I want to thank you again for being part of this book club. I hope you're enjoying it. If you want to ask me any questions on Twitter, definitely do that at Jonathan Little, and I will be back next time.
All right, so Section 3, Chapters 7 and 8, we're talking now about still playing deep stack, but now we're talking about the turn and the river. So for me, some of the things that I guess resonated regarding check raising the turn, he says it should be rare and maybe only done when we think the opponent is strong but we're stronger. The turn can be a very difficult spot, and for me it was a reminder of the importance of position. position. I thought it was super interesting talking about river bet sizes. What's your sizing? Depending on if you want somebody to call, you want somebody to fold. How do your opponents interpret your river bet sizes? All that stuff was interesting to me. And then something, if we have time to talk about, just this idea of blocking bets. We talked about it briefly in one of the other episodes, and I never use blocking bets. I never ever think about putting a bet out there because I think it's going to be less than my opponent might bet or something like that. So that was interesting to me, just to kind of hear his perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't know. That was sort of interesting to start with blocking bet because, in our very aggressive tournaments, you're always going to get re-raised, is what I thought on that. So he says, don't use it against good players. Well, okay, let's not use it because there's good players at the table. But There's a lot of, I left those comments on bluffing on the river is a bad idea, and usually. So what I found was interesting was he was talking about raise sizing, and he's talking about doing a consistent, half the pot or 3/4 of the pot. We went through the, but if you sort of do that math in these tournaments, and Steve and I were talking a little bit, you get to the middle part of the tournament, and the average stack is somewhere around 40 blinds, and you bet half a pot into a pre-flop pot. Well, that pot's already got 20 blinds in it, so you're putting 10 big blinds into it. If you do that again, you're putting another 10 to 20 big blinds. Very quickly in these tournaments now, we're seeing that you're putting, if you followed that bet sizing, we would be putting almost our whole stack in every time we're playing a hand, if we're continuing in the hand, So I have a little trouble because I'm not playing 200 plus big blind tournaments enough.
For me, one of the things that I think is just interesting to talk about is the idea of on the river calling, and calling when you think you're beat, and using pot odds to justify the call. And he was talking about too the benefit of seeing the opponent's hand and seeing what they've got. Just that whole idea of calling on the river when you think it's likely that you're beat. And maybe something we can talk about some more, because I think it's really interesting.
I like the startup, the bet when they check concept of not just whether you have it or not, just that being aggressive idea. The blocking bet is something I actually felt like I would do all the time, and I didn't think it was that bad, but now listening, so I'm going to be more paying closer attention to if it's working or not working. I was thinking it was working most of the time when I do that kind of thing, so we'll see. Maybe it's just because of the groups that I play with or whatever. So the concept, whenever you raise, think about what your opponent can call, and if it's not much, shy away from raising. So just thinking ahead, not just I want to raise because I want to get more in there, but is it going to get me anything more, or is it going to get them to fold, or what are they going to call with, or what do I need to raise to get them to fold? If that's what I want them to do, is fold rather than build the pot. And then just that concept of getting players to bluff into you as being one of the most profitable situations to be in, and how to work that in, because I don't feel like I'm doing that at all or know what I'm supposed to do to get that to work. But that sounds like a good thing to work on or to focus on.
All right, some of the things that I've already incorporated into my game, which I never really consciously thought of before, is betting on the river. When you bet on the river, what are you betting for? You can't bet on the river unless you know for a fact that you have this guy beat, right? You can only bet for value when you know you have him beat, because what the heck are you going to do when he comes over the top here? Value betting on the river. And I never thought of value betting as much as I just said, well, I got a big hand, I'm going to bet. And what can he call you with? So there's times where I have a big hand, I might have a top pair hand, and I won't bet the river, because all he's going to do is fold if he doesn't have it, and if he's got me beat, he's going to come over the top of me, and I just wasted a bet.
I actually basically second is just the reminder of thinking about what you're betting, why you're betting. Are they going to actually can they come up here with a second place hand to you? You know what I mean, a call? Or are you just inducing either a big bluff that you don't want to have to now call? So just kind of being smart about when you do that. And then I also just wrote down that a reminder that with weaker draws, play more passively, because you have to get folds more often to show a profit. And I just think he talked a lot about in 7 about the different types of draws, and I guess I don't normally qualify my draws as weak or strong. I'm on a drawing hand and I'm floating or I'm doing whatever, so I thought it was a kind of a smart concept to think about actually qualifying your draw, whether it's weak or strong or whatnot. And obviously then, like he said, play more passively to show profit. So.
For me, and I think it's been echoed already, is understanding what you're trying to accomplish on the turn and river with your bet sizing, and what your opponent can come along with, or what options are available to your opponent based on your bet sizing, and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to get to the river, how do you manage that on the turn? When you get to the river, are you trying to get them to fold, or are you trying to get them to pay you off? And so understanding what the bet sizing is going to be for you with those things is probably the biggest thing to take out of these two sections.
I think it's already been said, but for me, two of the biggest things were punishing weakness. So if they check to you, bet. And I probably don't do that often enough. Also, for your river bets, being more, particularly if you have a strong hand and you want to call, be more cognizant of betting an amount that they can call. Whereas I tend to bet, if a pot size bet will put them all in, I tend to do that, forgetting that people value their tournament life and they're much more likely to put in half their stack than they are their whole stack. So those are a couple of concepts.
I'm just going to kind of be echoing a lot of what people are saying, but the concept of having a reason to bet and kind of following through on that is a big thing. I think it comes back to keeping decisions simple. So I think I started off the first discussion by saying you have to have a reason to be betting. You can't just bet because you think you're ahead. I think that is very, very important on the river because there's no more cards to come. So that was a big piece for me. And then I think just the keeping your decisions simple. Like it makes your whole game much more easier if you're having simple decisions and you're feeling confident about the decisions that you're making.
Okay, so obviously a lot there about knowing why you bet and how much to bet. And I think that's always a question. Something for my game is, what am I doing here? Why am I betting? And I think you still hear that quite a bit. Well, I had a good hand, so I bet. Mm-hmm. But, as I've talked to people too, it's like, well, are you betting for value? Or are you betting? Why are you betting? And I think sometimes you don't even really know why you're betting. So talk about that a little bit more. Like what are the reasons why you bet, and at what point do you make the decision that I'm not going to bet because there's not enough that, because if you're betting for value, you're basically saying, I think there are hands that are worse than mine that will call me. Mm-hmm. But obviously there's always the risk that somebody's slow playing a monster, and so you always have that risk of being re-raised. And so how do you face that trade-off of going, when is it enough to value bet versus the risk of being re-raised and, not wanting to live with skeletons always, in your closet waiting to jump out at you, out of fear that somebody's going to re-raise you. So how do you guys balance that when you think, okay, I've got a pretty good hand here. I think there's enough to call me, but yet...
You have to think ahead. I mean, you have to, sit there and go in your head, okay, could this opponent raise me? And what would they be raising me with? And how am I going to react to that raise? And if you have top pair and you go, okay, if this person raises me, I have to fold because I don't know what they have, that's when the check is probably the better option. You're just going to put yourself in a bad spot if you go, I think my top pair is good, but if they raise me, I have to fold. You're just setting yourself up for failure. Whereas if you check and you take down a smaller pot because you were right, you still get to scoop that pot. You're not opening yourself up to failure.
But does it become mathematical at some point, or the principle of it? Like, let's say, okay, I know there's a 10% chance he could re-raise me here. Whatever, just say you have a number in your mind or whatever. But yet you know that he's going to call you with any queen. Any of his queen combinations are going to call you, and you have kings or something. So it seems like there's a trade-off there.
Yeah.
I get that it's maybe, do you want to play higher variance or lower variance? So you could say, I know I'm going to, but I feel like sometimes I lose a lot of value because I do check down a lot of rivers where I think I'm losing value because of that fear of being re-raised. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you trade that off if you do think you've got some worse hands that might call you?
A lot of it, I think, plays into how had the hand gone prior to this. Say you have top pair of kings and there's a queen out there as well, and you think they might have a queen. How many streets of value are you going to get from your opponent? If you bet the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river, are they going to call you each and every street? Probably not without top pair. Yeah, because they have to put you on something better than that if you're firing 3 streets. If you fired the flop and then check the turn, and you kind of give this impression that I might not have a queen, then you might be able to get another street of value from an opponent having a queen. So you have to kind of balance that out in your head, figure out, okay, what am I actually representing with all my aggression prior to this and right now? and how is my opponent going to react to that?
Okay.
So it might be more of the pessimistic view versus the optimistic view. I'm looking at, I got top pair with the kings. I want to bet because I want them to fold now before they might have an ace, and an ace comes up and I'm going to end up folding later. I feel like I'm ahead now. I want to win it now while I feel comfortable. And that worry of if something else comes up, I might get scared away.
So there's kind of two. There's betting for value and there's betting for protection. And you guys can help me clarify that. But betting for value is really thinking, I'm going to bet here because I think a lot of worse hands are going to call me. And then there's betting for protection, which is really saying, I'm going to bet here because I don't want a scare card to come and somehow lose this pot.
And they're two very different
And
things.
so how do you, what are you doing when you have king 10, on a king jack 7 board, or king jack 7-2 board, and you bet? I mean, I know it's each situation depends, but are you betting for value?
Well, I think
Because
this
you're going
is-
to call for
this
jacks,
is-
or are you betting for protection, or are you doing both?
I think this is where it backs up, and we've already kind of, this book's very chronological, and so we're doing things before we get to the turn and river to make those decisions easier for us, right? So in a situation of your king jack 7 deuce on the turn, we're probably checking the turn, right? Because we have top pair with kind of a crap kicker, so we're probably going to execute pot control.
You've already bet the flop, and they call.
Right.
Assume.
We've already assumed, right? We're going to assume a few things, that we're following his instructions and that we raised it in position pre-flop. The flop came and it was checked to us and we continuation bet and got called. The turn comes, they check to us, now we execute pot control. Our decision is already made for the river that we're just going to either check behind or we're going to call a bet, right? We might bet for value,
right,
based on what kind of comes.
One more street,
right?
one more bet.
Right. There might be one more bet on the river, kind of based on what we think of their hand strength and on all of that type of stuff. So a lot of this betting on the river or even betting on the turn is all kind of predicated on everything that was set up ahead of time. And so the things that you can do early on in the hand to make your decisions easier later on. You're not having to try and just, what do I do in this position when I'm sitting on the river and I've got king 10 and it's king jack 7 deuce 4, right? And now I feel like I'm trying to get value because I have top pair, and what do I do? Well, how did you play it previous to that, before you got there? How you played it previous is really going to predicate what you're going to do in that spot.
Is that part of your point, Taylor, a little bit with how things played out? Like if they have a jack, they might call the flop bet, but they're probably not going to call a turn bet also.
Yep.
So that's where you're
Yep.
kind of, to John's point weeks ago, you're kind of checking for value there in a sense of, so if you bet there, really you'd be betting for protection, and you're probably going to blow them off, or all of their worst hands.
Potentially,
If you bet.
And lose to all the better ones.
Well,
right.
and
So,
that's just it. Oftentimes, your actions before specifically getting to the river, right? When you get to the river, everything that happened prior to the hand is really going to help you dictate what you do, whether you're going to bet or you're going to check behind, because there's value in seeing what their hand is. If you check behind and you have a better or worse hand, doesn't really matter. There's value in seeing what those cards are, so that next time you're in a hand with them, you kind of know how they're expecting to play it. So there's value in that. I think that if you proceed in such a manner on pre-flop and the flop and then the turn, in a way that you're thinking about how the river is going to play out and what your actions are going to be, you don't have to ever question, what am I supposed to do on the river? Am I supposed to value bet here? Am I betting for, well, there's no protection necessary anymore because there's no more cards to come. So either on the river, you're either betting for value or you're betting to get your opponent to fold.
Right.
That's really it. And then what John had said at the beginning of this, talking about, I used to just bet enough to put my opponent all in. Well, your opponent's really only going to call you on an all in if you're beat.
Yeah.
Period. I mean, very rarely it does happen, but for the most part, people aren't going to call off with a weak hand when it's all of their chips. They're just not going to. So to find out if you're behind or not, or that it's big enough that they would risk all their chips, you can bet a lot smaller and they can raise and give you that information that way.
So on the river, I usually bet my flush draws. So you're saying that's a mistake to bet my flush draws on the river?
No, but it depends on the river. Well, if you snap shove, and there's only 7,000 in the pot, and you snap shove 30,000. Yeah, that's really bad.
I mean, in my defense, it's a semi-bluff.
Yeah, it's a
If you get the right pot odds, you just call.
yeah.
This is what you were just saying there is that later in the book he talks about be conscious of what you're inducing when you're betting. That's sort of the concept of thinking about, do you want them to call you or not? And but it's.
And if you're not sure that you want them to call, there's no problem checking there.
Checking, yeah.
Because, like I said, you're still getting value if you check there. Number one, you're getting the pot if you have the best hand. Number two, if you don't have the best hand, you're getting the value of the information of seeing how they played that pot.
Right.
And I think you had mentioned too, is there a mathematical equation to playing a high enough, are you maximizing value? Well, in a tournament, I don't know that you're, in a cash game, you should maximize every possible
EV or whatever.
But in a tournament, like we said earlier, you can give up on a little bit of plus EV just and not make that play because it's a tournament. And I think I personally do struggle with being a little too risk averse, and so to your credit about, is there a mathematical equation to it or what? I don't know, but finding that line is difficult. Am I getting enough value out of some of these bigger hands versus being a little risk averse and just taking the pot now and then telling myself, well, it's a tournament, and that I'm surviving. I'm happy just taking this pot. You know what I mean? But how much are you leaving a lot on the table then?
Yeah. My new line at the tournament is always, I just say, this is the worst just call ever. I was playing with Kyle Baker. I said, you watch this guy. This is the worst just call ever, where I just called with a straight or something. Part of that because of that.
And there's a flush on the board and you got a straight. It was a perfect move, right? So
I don't know. It's tough to know. You know what I mean? If you're being aggressive. If you're being aggressive yourself enough in allowing variance to kind of come into play.
But then I watch, you watch some of these, whether it's on TV or I'll watch a Luke Mernon or some of these guys, and I'll be at the table with them. They get so much value out of their hands. I see them value at the river, and of course they're not always right or whatever. But I just how do you extract another bet out of that? Because they just know. I mean, they've thought it through. They have the logic or whatever, and they're betting, second pair for value. Yeah. It's insane, and they get called. So that's the kind of thing where it's I feel like I'm losing value on the table. But to your point, it's a trade-off for me. It's the survival, the risk-reward. It's a sharp ratio for all you investment folks.
Well, and they've ranged you better. They've paid more attention. They're more alert to these things, and they know they're ahead with their second pair.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy.
And I'm not at that level when I get to the river with the second pair against one of the best players in the state.
Right.
Whether I'm ahead or not, I'm having a lot of trouble with that. So.
Yeah, that's part of knowing the player too. Especially against some good players, I'll just check down more often.
Yeah, and so it's he counsels us to be aggressive, and he gives us all this. What to bet and how to bet and what size to bet and where and what position. But then later on he's saying, wait a second, pot control, save your stack, do some other things. So it's a balancing equation. And so one of the things I find that there's an awful lot of very, very aggressive players in some of these fast tournaments, right? So you just go to ultra conservative. You never bet when you have the best hand, right? You check raise them to death, you do whatever. You know that bet's coming. It might be 2-3 bets before it comes on your flop straight, Jam it in then, but if you jam early, they'll fold because you've never played a hand, right? So it's all balance, right?
Brian, how do you determine if you're going to bet or not? You're a fairly aggressive player, so I'm kind of curious, do you go through
that information?
Oh yeah, nobody. I don't know which Brian. I'm talking Brian Soja, who's just changed his voice a little bit. But no, I mean, how do you determine?
It
is there conscious?
Depends on who you're playing against. I mean, whenever I go to a table, if I don't know who they are, I lay back a little bit until I figure out something on them. I mean, some of the fast tournaments you don't get that opportunity as much, but I play more conservative when I don't know the people. I play. More aggressive when I do know the people, regardless how they're playing, because I got a better understanding of what they're going to do. And I try to mix it up, but, sometimes you make bad mistakes, you get called, you get caught, it's going to happen. But like you said, if you're not making those kind of mistakes, you're not going to be a good player.
Right. Whereas
I'm not nearly as aggressive as most people,
Yeah.
probably don't do a lot of things, blocking bets and things, floating as much as I should. But
So when you're making the decision to bet, and if you or for the group, but you're making the decision to bet, is it a real?
yeah,
Do you find yourself
it
with the
really
discipline
depends
to
on
say really
my hands, the
consequentious-
cards, the people I'm up against.
Because I'd like to think I think through all that stuff, but push come to shove, sometimes I'm just betting and then going, what am I? Oh,
It's
just
more
seems
fun
like
to bet.
I'd like to say it's instinct and it's all these
When-
years of experience, but sometimes I feel like I'm just betting because I can't stop myself.
And sometimes, and
well, I'm being
well,
honest.
I think some people, and sometimes everybody does that. Right? When you're playing your best, you're thinking about all these
Yeah.
kind of things, and you're taking the time to do
Right.
that, not making just really rash decisions. I like to make quick decisions, but not really quick.
So grounded.
Take time to think about it. I mean,
Yeah.
put it through your head. I mean, some people, if you're not good at multitasking, I mean, sometimes the tournament aspect of it isn't as good for you because it becomes more difficult.
Yeah.
But don't you think when you're making that bet and you're thinking, oh, I'm making the bet, you probably are thinking more than, I mean, even if you're I don't know if it's subconscious,
Yeah.
but you're making that bet, but more than likely, even though it feels like, oh, I'm just making a bet here. Hopefully, if you've been playing long enough, you've absorbed some things where hey, this guy's done something that gave me the impression that he's weak, or, I mean, a lot of that stuff. Hopefully, some of that stuff comes without having to sit down and think for 10 seconds or 20 seconds. What am I going to do here? Because you don't have that much time. Hopefully, some of that's coming to you where you're over experience. You're going to hopefully make more of the right plays just based on your experience, even though sometimes it feels like you're just.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes that is just just kind of know this is kind of what you do. But there are other times where I'll be going home or I'll be thinking like, what was I trying to do there? Like what would even be the right?
But
what I mean? So sometimes yes,
You got to
sometimes no.
make mistakes to get better.
Oh, sure.
Everybody.
Sure.
That's right.
But I'd like to at least
But
think I'm thinking about like,
You got to think ahead. I mean, I'm always thinking ahead, and then you're changing as the flop comes or whatever, and who stays in and who goes out. If you're not continuously thinking about that stuff, and you're just thinking one goal, barrel. I mean, it's not going to work, right? You're going to lose your chips eventually, even if you're getting super lucky.
Yeah.
Sometimes not.
Yeah.
But
No. I mean, I do need to think forward more.
I mean, you wonder why the best players are the best players because, they do. And you got to play a lot. I mean, if you're not playing a lot to face these situations, you're not going to have the opportunity to get a lot better.
Anything else about making decisions on betting or not, why you bet, but also then we can shift to bet sizing too, which is I think another interesting topic we can touch on some.
Yeah, he had a comment in here about not putting your opponent all in, like John was talking about. Betting on an amount that they can call without risking their tournament life, and that's how you're going to get value on the river. I saw just yesterday in my league that I was in yesterday. I saw the guy ended up getting value, but he did it poorly. It's just that the other guy was even worse.
That's what I like.
Can I get to that tournament?
He got the nut flush on the river, and the flop was I think Queen Jack 10. It was obvious the other guy had the Ace King, and he had Ace Queen of clubs, and the club hit the river. He just went all in.
Yeah.
And the guy was so bad that he didn't even realize that there was a flush out there, and that he was crushed. All he saw was, I got the problem.
I got the nuts. Yeah.
So it was maybe he did it knowing this opponent, but I thought both plays were really bad from the standpoint of how would you normally get value if you were in a tournament with that hand? You would probably, at that point in time, because you know what he has, you would probably check, let him bet, and then get value that way. Because if you bet into him when there's a flush on the board, is he going to call?
That's so risky though. I don't know. I don't know if I could check there. I'd be so worried that it's gonna go check.
I would check behind if I did.
Because if I know he's got Ace King, don't you think he's gonna call a reasonable bet?
A reasonable bet. That's the key. He went all in.
Oh no, I agree with that. But
So,
what if I check? Don't you
He
think
could
there's a
either
chance
check
he checks behind?
or make maybe half a pot bet or maybe a 3/4 pot bet to make it enticing.
Right.
To make it look like you're trying to steal because there's a scare card out there.
Yeah.
But what he did is he jammed, and I'm going, whoa.
Yeah, I don't agree with the
when
jam.
he jammed, I'm
Yeah.
going, well, he's got to have the flush, and that's the first thing I thought of. And this guy over here calls.
Snap calls.
Well, you have to have Ace King.
That's the key as well. I mean, not only to make a bet size they can call, but but a bet size they can call with a worse hand.
Correct.
Right, exactly.
Correct.
Because
Well, he had the nuts, so anything.
well,
was-
right, in
worse
that
hand.
particular
Yeah.
example. But a lot of times
Right.
you want to get value even when you don't have the nuts.
Right. Right.
And then you need to make sure that you're making a call that over time is going to get you value from worse hands.
Was this hand
not
on the
just
flop he
losing
went
the
out
better
with?
ones?
No, this was on the river.
Oh, okay.
He rivered.
I thought
he
you
rivered
meant
the,
on the flop. Cause
No,
it
he
seems
rivered
like,
the flop. He rivered the nut flush.
Yeah.
So when you think about, John, when you think about like extracting value on a non-nutted hand, like, so are you going through the process of going, boy, I think a lot of his range here is second pair, third pair, and so do you kind of consciously say, you know, what do I think he'll call with the jack, or is it what's your process of going, what's my bet size here to extract value?
Well, I have a mathematical formula.
I
wish I did. You know, I don't know that I actually.
It's just like a feel, kind of like.
I think it's more feel than anything, but it's. I at least recognize that's what I should be doing. Whether or not I do
Right,
that
right.
is a completely different question. But you just try to look at it, and sometimes I'll make really small river bets with a fairly weak hand.
Right.
But I'm fairly certain they don't have a better one. Like they're just sitting on naked ace king or ace queen, and I think they'll call it. And every chip helps in a tournament,
Right.
and if I'm confident enough in that read, I'll try doing that. And it has to be the type of person who's not gonna
Come back over the top.
right, exactly, who's not gonna abuse that. So do it to someone like Soja.
Because I always fold. That's all I do. I never play a hand. I fold every time.
You know, these decisions get really complicated. I was just in the hand over aces 2 Fridays ago, and we got heads up by the turn. Everybody had folded, and we'd both on the turn gotten to Broadway, and there was 2 clubs and 2 hearts on the board, and I had ace king of hearts. So he puts in a reasonable sized bet at me. And I think about it for a long time. It says 90% of the time we're probably chopping this. We got to Broadway. Neither one of us says. But he had made a really big fold to me earlier in the tournament. So I said, and I had like 500 more chips than he did, and he knew that. I mean, he was a real smart aces regular and everything. I thought, I wonder if I just jam here, whether he'll go away. You know, I said, I could lose to the clubs. You know, but other than that, it's either chop or I win, you know. So, and he could be chasing a boat, but I don't think he's calling it all in on a chase of a boat behind Broadway. So I jammed, and he tanked for a really, really long time and called. And they debated that at the table for the next hour after that. I didn't, and he didn't. You know, I thought I did as good on that hand as I could. What do you think?
We both had Broadway.
I think you put it.
We both had
But you
Broadway.
don't know he has Broadway.
I didn't know yet, but I was very confident.
But you
that
got
he
the
had
nuts?
Broadway.
Did you have the nuts?
Well, you
No, I had Broadway with 4 heart flush draw, and we had the
Well,
river to
So
go.
if
the
you had
Broadway
Broadway,
was the nuts, though. Right?
you had the
Yeah,
nuts.
Broadway was, at that moment
Yeah,
was the nuts.
Yeah, okay.
And
So you've got the nut. You've got the nuts with the nut draw. You're pretty sure your
You're
opponent
free-rolling.
also has the same nut draw. If you think your opponent's going to call the all in, then get it all in right there. Because
100%.
the worst case scenario, you chop.
Well,
In
first
this
he
case-
hits a club. No,
well, he could have
Well,
hit the
yeah,
clubs,
yeah,
you know,
you're right.
1 out of 6 times.
Okay,
I said,
if he has the club, that's fine too, because you both want to get it all in. Both of you want to get it all in.
well,
think-
worst case is if he's got, because the other guy's got 2 pair and he has a boat. I mean, there's.
yeah, now that's what I was saying to
You're
myself.
going to win so much more
Oh,
often.
I'm not disagreeing with the show.
Okay,
I'm just
yeah.
saying there are worst cases.
There are.
And
He's
said
putting
those.
pressure on him. I mean, there is fold equity.
There was fold
Yeah,
equity.
there's for sure.
I said it
But
really.
do you want him to fold?
Do you, that's my question.
I don't think you want him to fold, so that's the question.
That's why.
That's
why
why I
started
asked
that
the
with,
question.
If
Yeah,
you
that-
think he's going to call,
Correct.
then fold. That's
Correct.
why I started that.
Right.
If
Right.
you think he's going to fold,
Right.
then
you bet
you
something
don't want to
smaller.
shove.
You bet
Yeah.
something small.
Because
Yeah.
what if he doesn't have the same hand, Broadway, and the river's a complete blank? You still want to get value out of your nuts.
Right.
Was it a massive pot already?
No,
Was there some
no,
value
it was
in just
about, it wasn't massive up to them.
Until I jammed.
We had 4 people come in on like a 3-blind bet, or it was a little bigger than that because the pot table was a little more aggressive. So 4 people came in on maybe a 6-blind bet. There was 24 blinds out there, but we each had 40 blind stacks. So when I jammed, I was jamming a pot's worth. It was a pot bet, is what it was actually. So. And I just thought it was reasonable at that point in that tournament to risk my tournament life on that hand.
Well, you're not risking
With the
your
nuts.
tournament life with the
Low
nuts.
risk.
The only
Well,
one I
you
showed
risk,
there,
you
I
could have
saw
lost.
risking.
No, it could have lost a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Club flush and any boat.
If,
If
if
he
you're,
had
if
trumps
you're
or
thinking
2
about
pair.
risking your tournament life when you've got the dead nuts in your hand, then you're
Then I'm not.
With one card to
way.
come.
I'll take as much money in there. Were you gonna say
I'll
something?
push every cent I have in
Or
there.
no? Okay.
Well, I think just from the scenario you described, it's kind of funny, and not to contradict the idea of check raising the river, but I put a note down about how Jonathan reasoned for not check raising the river when you do have pretty strong holdings. I don't think he necessarily said the nuts, but just where you're reasonably sure you're ahead after you bet the flop and the turn to a call. And I thought his reasons for it made a lot of sense. And I don't know how many of you guys check raise rivers with big hands anyway, because you always are nervous the other person's just going to check back and you get nothing out of it. And that was his main reason. But I thought the other 2 reasons he named were pretty interesting. And just that if you check and he does raise, he likely would have just called your raise. So now you've allowed, and then when you raise, he folds. So now you've allowed that person to dictate the pot size that they're, the amount they're going to bet, where you could raise larger and probably have got a call. I thought that was a pretty smart idea. And also that you miss money when you bet and he re-raises and now you re-raise and get called, you potentially lose quite a big pot that could have brewed if you to just bet out and that person re-raises you by chance, Now you've lost that bet, and or if you re-raise and they still call that too. So anyways, I thought those are some pretty good reasons for just taking the check raise on the river out of the arsenal when you've got a big hand.
Just lead out.
Just lead out.
There's kind of a
It's not necessarily an ironclad 100%.
No, but I like
see
leading out.
those 3 reasons make sense.
it's safe. There's a kind of a hard and fast rule in poker, and that is, if someone who hasn't been aggressive until the river all of a sudden comes out firing on the river, they've got it. Not like a snap shove like I talked about before, where it's clear that they probably have a flush draw and missed it. But it's kind of a straightforward board, and you're sitting there with top pair, top kicker, or whatever it is, and you have position on them. They've just been kind of calling all the way down, and all of a sudden now they bet the river, and it's a reasonable bet, like 3/4 of the pot or something like that. You're probably beat. Because what else would they be? What else would they be kind of making a reasonable bet with? They're going to be betting for the same reasons that you are, right? Which is either A, to extract value, or B, to get your opponent to fold a better hand. All right. Well, if they have a good hand and they've just been calling, kind of setting the trap, well, now they're firing out because they don't want to lose value on that hand, or they have complete air. Well, if it wasn't a draw heavy board to begin with, they're not firing out on a missed draw because there was no draws to begin with. So what are they left with? A big hand that they're trying to extract value out of.
Yeah, he mentions that in that book too about, I think there was a time where you were wondering what he...
Oh, about the pair of kings.
Yeah, like if you have a pair
folding
of
the
kings
pair-
and by the time you get to the river, your opponent goes all in or something like that.
And
they probably got 2 pair or better, so you just throw your hand away and move on, but...
Yeah. And that's something, and I've seen that more. I remember actually who said it to me when they said it to me. I remember where we were, because I had never really kind of thought about that, and a hand had just happened where I thought the whole way that I was super good. Like I never once thought that I was in bad position, and then all of a sudden they fired the river, and I was just like, what? It made no sense at all to me. And so then, because it didn't make sense, I'm like, oh, well, they've got to be perfect. And so I called, and no, they had me just completely destroyed. And I looked over, and I'm like, and it's someone I've known for a long time and respect, and I'm just like, and he's like, no, if they're leading out on it, they have it. I mean, look at that board. There's no draws, there's no nothing. They clearly had you beat. I would have folded that every time. And it wasn't like, Or it wasn't top pair. It was something stronger than just one pair. I can't remember if it was two pair or whatever it was. But he was like, you were clearly beat there. He's like, unless you have the stone cold nuts, don't call. There's no reason for it.
I don't know that I've ever checked raise a river in my life. I can't remember a time I've ever checked raised a river.
Only there's one person that used to play Epic that I would check raise rivers with, but that's it. There's only one person. I would say situation, just one person that I would do that because I know they're going to bet every river. That's the only time.
Is that just because you're afraid of losing value?
No, because yes, that's probably more.
And that's just it. Most people
they
don't want to lose their value.
Why would
so if they're checking on the river, it's generally not to check raise.
Right.
It's generally not.
Yep.
In rare instances, because
it's a good point.
You can check raise the flop or you can check raise the turn. You can try to set your trap because there's still cards yet to come.
Mm-hmm.
When the river comes, it's over, right? So if you've got a big hand, you're like, I want to get value from it. I made a big hand because how often do you make a big hand? So people tend to lead out with that because they don't want to not get their value. Check raising on the river is very difficult to pull off. First off.
So if you think you have the nuts and your first bet on the river, do you check raise then?
If I've got a super strong hand, it really kind of depends on who I'm up against and how the hand has played out. If I've got a big hand and I think that they're going to bet the river, I'm not going to bet it for them because if I bet, they can just call and I'm not going to get as much. No, give them a chance to bet it. I don't want to bet and then have them fold.
So that's a situation where you check raise.
Absolutely.
I would only do that if I really felt like they had a really weak hand. Like if I felt like they had a reasonably good hand, I would probably still lead into them. Just because if they've been betting the whole time you've been calling, if they have a reasonably good hand, I would expect them just to check behind. But if I think they've just been betting with air or a misdraw the whole time, then I'd be more likely to let them bet because that's the only way. Because you're not going to get called.
Correct.
But I think you're advocating for if you reasonably feel like they've got a pretty strong holding, occasionally sneaking.
Or just anytime you feel that they're going to put out a bet when you have them beat, check it to them. Because you're not going to get the same value if you bet. You're just not. They're either going to fold or they're going to come over the top in such a fashion that now all of a sudden you have to have a super strong holding to get that value back. So just check it to them. I on the river, I very, very infrequently, well, if I'm out of position, will I lead out. Very infrequently. The only way I will is if I think that they're going to raise me when I know that I can either get them to fold to a 3-bet or they're going to call my 3-bet. That's it. That's the only reason for it. Because I'm not going to get enough value over time by block betting. I'm just not. The value on the river there comes from the check. I mean, in that specific hand, the value might be the block bet, but over time, you're going to extract more value in those spots by checking than you are by leading out.
So you've done a lot of check raising on the river.
I mean, I do it. Yeah. I mean, I don't do it every time, but do I do it?
Usually,
absolutely.
Maybe I'm just not getting good enough hands to be in that position.
Once in a while. You gotta get in that position.
It's very rare for me to give up on a hand before all the cards are out.
That's true.
Everybody can make a pact. It'll be like our bucket list.
Okay.
We'll start check raising.
Let's check raise the
river.
We'll keep track.
We'll let each other know when we check raise the river.
Well, and once in a while you'll get into a day one on one of these multi-days and a couple of these real aggressive guys will get it and they'll 4-bet the river.
Yeah.
More than once in the tournament. The same two guys will go, oh, how do you decide where to fold here? You know, I mean, you both decided we're going to bash heads until they're bloody.
It's a leveling war. I mean, I've seen two of the top states pros once, and I was at the table, and I was like, this is a nightmare that we were all at the same table together, and it went 7 bets pre-flop.
Sweet. Love that.
One of them had 8 high. The other one had 7 high.
Right. Love it. That's what I was seeing when I saw this happen.
Don't try that at home.
But there's something to be learned from that. Right? I mean, they're just and it's amazing to see that they were both right. I mean, they both were just like spot on, and I actually kind of sat back and I'm like, do either one of them have anything good, or are they both just firing away with crap? And we ended up getting to the and we saw that they both had just crap. The whole the rest of the table's like, oh my god, and I'm just like, oh, that
a
makes
lot
sense.
of times they do that because they don't care
Huh?
if they
You win
lose.
7-bet
They're
call.
gonna rebuy, and you think they're just the loosest player ever.
Yeah.
And when they do get in a situation where they get chips, guess what? It's
Yeah,
not gonna happen
you're right.
that way.
Now you know they're capable of it, though. That's just sort of that. Now you know that they're capable of doing this.
But
when I have,
but they're
queens,
capable. The thing you got to remember too is they're capable of doing it at the right time.
Right, absolutely.
They're not going to do it at the long time. And
Yeah, they're not
good
doing it
players,
heads up at the final table for the
No,
championship.
good players,
Yeah.
once they get chips, I mean, they're only going to be all in if they typically have
But
the
if they
best hand.
4-bet me and I have queens, I'm going to at least know they're capable of doing that light.
Yeah. They're
So,
capable of it.
You know, and
And
so
they know that you know that they're capable of it, so
Right.
then
if
when
they have
they...
aces or whatever,
Yeah.
you're,
Well, that was
If
why-
they're that good, my queen's
So, but-
going all in with them, and I'm just like,
well, right.
But you had asked if I check raise a lot on the river,
That's
and
what
it's
they
not that
want,
I
yeah.
necessarily check raise a lot on the river, but I check call with the best hand to get the best.
That's what
Because-
I was saying.
because
check
it's-
call
Yeah,
a
that's
lot.
It's
I check call a lot on the river.
That's pot control.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also bluff catching.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know,
That's
if your opponent has air, what good does it do you to bet?
Yeah.
If you were gonna you were gonna win the pot regardless.
Right.
Right. If they have air, you're winning whether you bet or you check.
maybe that's why I'm not check raising a lot, is because I'm checking to maybe hopefully induce them to
For sure,
get
I'll
in.
check call.
I'll check call, check call,
Yeah.
check call all day long.
All day
But-
long, you
Well,
promise.
I will.
You
That's
want
a-
to
That's
bet
a
on
full
that-
day,
when
right?
you
I
got
know,
the
I'll
call
just do it.
station.
I'll be doing it all night long.
Regardless
the
if
calling
you have
station
man or
guy.
Can I just be the TD tonight? Can I, right?
Yes. Yes, that's binding.
Yeah.
Did you have some, Doug?
No, but if you got showdown value, you need to check call
Mhm.
all day long.
All I know is I'm playing totally different.
Well, and we're encountering that a little bit more, and I think there's a certain hyper aggressiveness. They're talking at the World Series of Poker. There was a commentary at some point along about the amount of maniac play that was going on, where people are either just almost going all in pre-flop at low blind levels through the whole tournament, till they're gone, and. The problem is you're calling off in tournaments anyways. You got to risk your tournament life to get the maniac off your table. You got pocket queens. You're ready to call his all in. He's got a bigger stack than you did because he stole all those blinds early on forever. And that's. But
Well,
eventually,
you can't play scared poker. Scared poker's losing poker.
Good,
Period.
good aggressive players aren't maniacs, so.
No, they're not.
No, but they were actually describing it as maniac. I mean, their play was to be so aggressive, you just can't call them without risking your life.
Yeah.
It's
And we know
basically-
people are running aces that'll play that way,
Oh,
in
yeah.
tournaments, and it can be really frustrating. But you can get a lot of chips that way too. But
They're
it's,
either in or they're out.
Yeah, but that's
Or
how
they buy
choose to
in
play.
7 times. Although that guy seems to be missing lately. He ran out of money.
Well, any other points about those issues? When to bet, size of bets.
So learning. We're always learning and adjusting at the table, right?
didn't he talk about opponent sizing
Yep.
bets? What was that? How would that go again? I can't remember. I'm trying to think.
Anybody remember the?
I don't remember exactly.
Bet an amount they can call.
But the,
You're talking about
Your
the size of your
opponents,
opponent's
yeah,
bet,
like-
right?
yeah, if your opponent bets, how do you interpret that size? And maybe it's different for.
Well, that's
Like
the
a
problem is it depends on the opponent. If it's a
Exactly.
good player and he's all of a sudden he's betting high, is he just or is it a bad player and he's betting? A lot of bad players will bet these monster bets, and they got pocket aces or something. That's not the time to.
Well, it came down to, he said some players will bet big if
When they have it.
Well,
Or
the opposite.
yeah, exactly.
Right, bet big if they don't want you to call. Bet small if they want you to call. And who for players who are consistent on that, then you can exploit that.
Right.
Because if they're betting big and you don't have a hand, then you can raise them. Or if you do have a hand, you can raise them because you'll either get more money or they'll fold. Or if they're betting small, you know that if you have a mediocre hand, it's not worth the call.
Yeah,
Or you have to raise big.
You want to be consistent to a point until you want to try to throw your game off somehow by not being consistent to make them think something else.
I think the consistency is in being inconsistent. It is. This is what we talked about even in the very first section
Yeah.
is about opening up your range right? And balancing it out. It's not so much about consistency, it's about balance, right? And so, are you, when we were on break and I was in the other room.
Bathroom, we call that?
Well, I was trying to be nice.
Were we doing it in the bathroom?
Thank you. I was trying not to, but I heard you ask about, what do you do when you have a deuce in your hand and the flop comes deuce, deuce, 7? Are you going to be betting there? Well, yeah, I'm going to be betting there.
Were you dropping a deuce?
Because, I sometimes I want to bet there and sometimes I don't want to bet there because I need to balance my range. I don't need it. I want to make sure that I'm not only checking when I miss the flop and betting when I hit the flop, or betting when I miss the flop and checking when I hit it. It's a balancing act, and the consistency comes from balance. Is where that.
But don't you want to balance by checking too when you hit a good?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah, okay.
Sometimes you want to check when you hit it. Sometimes you want to check when you miss it. Sometimes and vice versa.
Somewhere I've heard of that concept being called protecting your range.
Sorry.
If you make sure that with a wider portion of your range, you do all of those actions, that means the opponents can't properly narrow your range, because you may have raised with 8-7 suited when the flop was ace-king-10. Or you may have checked with top 2 pair, or you may have raised with top 2 pair, and that just makes it wildly tough to play against because they have to just guess.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, aggressive players are tough to play against.
For sure.
But if you're a good player, I'd rather be aggressive and good and balanced and consistent. A lot of aggressive players that we see at the rec table, they're aggressive and eventually it's just going to catch up.
There's no
I
balance.
mean, they're
They're not
4 or 5
aggressive, they're
times.
maniac.
Now, what I don't love playing with is the aggressive person that's semi-good,
Yeah.
They're just kind of, or maniacs are, I like, you've got to make sense of everything, and you got to, throw people off. So.
No, it puts a lot of pressure on you though when you feel like you have to make a hand. Whenever you're in that situation where
Yeah,
you
but
feel
not against.
if I have to make a hand against
if I
this
say
guy,
him, to me, it doesn't bother me.
well, he or
playing
anybody
but,
that's super
yeah.
aggressive behind you, that puts a lot of pressure on you.
But
You
when
have to be
they're
ready to put
aggressive
some
and
chips
they
to work.
somewhat
Absolutely.
know what they're doing,
You just can't, second pair. You have to be pretty comfortable with second pair in a lot of situations like that, and that's hard.
yeah, you got to play
Or
different.
third pair, bottom pair, or pair under the board.
Or right, exactly, right.
Depending on where
Or
you're sitting at,
or
whether
three.
you got to
Well,
play.
Well, any final comments on this deal? Otherwise, we'll wrap up this
Steve's
section.
gonna edit me out.
No. All right, we're good. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker. Well, that was a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed getting together with those guys. We got together for, 3-4 hours, and we were going to cover all 5 sections, but we only got through 3, and we barely scratched the surface. But great guys, great discussion, some people who are really eager to learn, much like many of you who are listening to this. So we're going to have more of those going forward, discussions that you can join us with. The next 2, sections 4 and 5, we did with a different group, whoever was available over a Skype call. So the next couple of weeks, you're going to hear sections 4 and 5, which covers chapter 9, will be next week, and then chapters 10 through 15 the following week. So if you're following along in the book, that's what you want to read. Just a reminder, All In for Africa, October 28th, with the Final Table broadcast, the Hawaiian cruise or Hawaiian trip, and a lot of other great things that are out there happening. Thanks again to all of our sponsors, the official sponsor, Running Aces, the official tour, Next Level Poker, as well as the Poker is Fun tour with upcoming events this coming weekend at Canterbury Park, and also to pokercoaching.com. Well, that's it for the week. Thank you all for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.